All right, so we're going to get started. Does everyone have a handout? Did everyone manage to get their hands on one? Yes? Okay. So we're excited to have our second session start now with a paper by Randy Clarke from Florida State University and comments from Michael Moore from Illinois Law. So if you could join me in welcoming Randy Clarke.
Well, many thanks to the organizers. So you'll see George and I are an unplanned tag team act here, so we'll see how it goes. So consider a couple of cases. First, Anne is about to leave her office for the day when her husband calls to ask her to get milk on the way home. Anne says she will. When she arrives home, she realizes she's forgotten to get the milk. Second, at Bob's request, his neighbor Sue took in his newspapers while he was away on a trip. Since returning, Bob has had ample opportunity to thank her, but he hasn't. It hasn't occurred to him to do so. These are cases of omission. The agents, we may suppose, are able to do certain things. They should do them, but they don't. And the omissions are what I'll call unwitting. The agents aren't aware on these occasions that they aren't doing the things in question. In some cases of this kind, the agents are morally blameworthy and blameworthy for the unwitting omissions. Granted, there's little at issue in Anne's or Bob's case. More is at stake in others. A house burns down because someone forgot to turn off a stove, or a child dies because she was left in a parked car on a hot day. Later in the paper I'll turn to some of these more high-stakes cases. There are several difficulties concerning how agents might be blameworthy for unwitting omissions. Working them out is an interesting project in its own right. It also has application to other phenomena. Cases of negligent action commonly involve a failure to advert to some morally relevant fact. And that failure is often an unwitting omission, a failure to inquire or investigate when one is unaware that one is omitting this act. Better understanding of negligent action might in turn contribute to our view of legal responsibility in such cases. However, my focus here is on the question of moral blameworthiness, and I'll focus on cases of unwitting omission. The main question I'll address is whether agents can be directly or non-derivatively blameworthy for such omissions, and I'll explain the adverb in a moment. I suggest that they can be, and I'll offer a view, I'll call it the ability view, on which conditions sufficient for direct blameworthiness can be met in such cases. Finally, I'll consider whether even a good-willed agent can be directly blameworthy for an unwitting omission. The question raises the issue of moral luck, but I don't think that this consideration tells decisively against an affirmative answer to it. Well, sometimes one's responsibility for an unwitting omission derives from or traces back to one's responsibility for prior things. For example, for prior actions or omissions from which the omission in question results. One decided not to leave oneself a reminder, knowing full well that one thereby risked forgetting to do what one had promised to do. And then one forgot to do it. One might be blameworthy for making that decision and derivatively blameworthy for the foreseen unwitting omission that results. Or someone might be so self-centered or inconsiderate that she rarely thinks to express gratitude to others who help her out. Perhaps one can be blameworthy for being this kind of person and then derivatively blameworthy for unwitting omissions that result from one's being so. But there are cases of unwitting omission in which blameworthiness cannot be traced back in this fashion. Anne was on her way out the door when her husband called. She has, let's assume, a normal capacity to remember commitments of the sort she made on this occasion. It was reasonable for her to entrust this one to memory. It would have bordered on compulsion for her to take time, for example, to set her phone to issue a reminder at the time she expected to near the store, and she isn't to blame for not doing this. Bob, we may imagine, isn't in fact a self-centered or inconsiderate person. He ordinarily expresses gratitude to others on occasions like this. His failure on this occasion to think to do so was uncharacteristic. Sometimes in such cases, the agent has an excuse. If Anne had witnessed a horrible traffic accident before reaching the store, it's understandable that she forgot about the milk. If Bob had been away to attend his mother's funeral after her unexpected death, it's no wonder that it slipped his mind to thank Sue on his return. Even when there's no such excuse, we sometimes write off the omission as just one of those things. Nobody's perfect. We might be less likely to do so when the consequences are grave, when, for example, a house has burned down or a child has died. When the tracing strategy is not applicable and no circumstance excuses, might an agent still be blameworthy for an unwitting omission? If she is, then she'd be directly blameworthy for it. Her blameworthiness for that omission would not trace back to or derive from her blameworthiness for any other thing. Is this possible? Well, I'll take it that when one is blameworthy for something, one is responsible for it. Moral blameworthiness, as I'm concerned with it here, is a modality of moral responsibility. Requirements for direct blameworthiness, then, include those for direct responsibility. It's standard to identify two conditions for direct responsibility, a control condition and a cognitive condition. The control condition is often thought to require some kind of freedom with respect to the thing in question. The cognitive condition is generally taken to concern awareness of what one is doing or of the moral significance of one's conduct. Many theorists take it that there's a requirement of moral competence for responsibility. To be morally responsible, it said, an agent must be able to recognize and respond to specifically moral reasons. The control and cognitive conditions might be understood as encompassing a requirement of this sort. In any case, I'll assume that in the cases that I discussed, the agents satisfy this moral competence requirement. My aim in what follows is to articulate a plausible control condition with respect to omitting to act, and a plausible cognitive condition with respect to the wrongness of one's conduct, such that in a case of unwitting omission, an agent can satisfy these conditions and so be blameworthy for her omission with no need for her blameworthiness to trace back to blameworthiness for any prior things. Though I'm inclined to think that the conditions I articulate are each necessary, it'll suffice for my purposes if they, with the presumed moral competence, are jointly sufficient for direct blameworthiness. It's common to think that negligent agents should have been aware of things of which they weren't aware. The thought is as applicable to agents in cases of unwitting omission. Absent excuses of the sort we imagined above, Anne should have remembered to get the milk, and Bob should have thought to thank Sue. It's plausible that the should here implies a can of some kind. A view that accommodates this position, then, will invoke some kind of capacity to think, to remember something, or to have certain thoughts come to mind, or some ability to act, for example, to turn one's attention to some matter, in such a way that certain thoughts are brought to mind. If the agent in a case of unwitting omission can think to do the thing that she omits to do, then in an ordinary case, she can realize that she wrongly isn't doing it. This latter capacity, together with the norm that calls on the agent to do the thing on this occasion, helps ground the claim that she can reasonably be expected to realize that she wrongly isn't doing the thing in question. She can and should realize this. So in brief runs the key portion of the ability view's account of how an agent can satisfy the cognitive condition for direct blameworthiness for unwitting omissions. I'll soon mention the remaining part. The proposed condition requires not that the agent was aware, but that she could and should have been aware that her conduct was wrong. The account identifies a psychological capacity in setting out how an agent might satisfy the could-have portion of the cognitive requirement. And satisfaction of the could-have portion is part of what satisfies the should-have portion. The remaining ground of the should-have portion might stem from an obligation that the agent has to perform the action in question. Anne, for example, was obligated by her commitment to stop and get milk. Given that obligation, and given that she was capable of remembering to get the milk, she should have remembered to get it. It was reasonable to expect her to remember her commitment, and reasonable to expect her to realize that in not stopping, she was doing wrong. She satisfies the proposed cognitive requirement for blameworthiness for her omission. Of course, we have a variety of psychological capacities of the sort alluded to here. Some are capacities to do things that are, in a plain sense, active, to turn one's attention to some matter, to raise a question in one's mind, or pursue such a question, to make a decision. Some are capacities to do things that aren't particularly active, or at any rate aren't intentional actions. These include capacities to recall, to think of relevant considerations, to notice features of one's situation and appreciate their normative significance. Rational creatures rely to a great extent on capacities to do things like this at appropriate times. A capacity of this sort is not a mere possibility, it's a mental power, even if not a power to act. We differ one from another with respect to the extent and strength of our psychological capacities of these kinds. On the proposed view, what one can be reasonably expected to think of on some occasion depends in part on the extent and strength of one's capacities to think of this or that. But it will, I think, need to take into account a further factor. One's psychological capacities can be masked by the situation one's in. A good deliberator might, in a highly stressful situation, fail to think of some pertinent fact that she'd ordinarily think of when deliberating about the matter at hand. Distraction can make someone with a good memory forget something she'd ordinarily think of. We expect people to think well in a variety of situations, but not in every kind, and it's reasonable to place such limits on our normative expectations. Circumstances that excuse an unwitting omission are sometimes those in which an agent's psychological capacities are masked in this way, or in which these capacities are diminished. If Anne had just witnessed a horrible accident, it might not be reasonable to expect her to remember or think to do certain things that she has a capacity to remember or think to do. And of course, factors such as lack of sleep can diminish one's capacities for these things. On the proposed view, then, we can have direct blameworthiness for an unwitting omission when one's failure to think of doing the thing in question was faulty, given what one was obligated to do, one's psychological capacities, and the situation one was in. In light of those capacities in that situation, it will have been reasonable to expect one with an obligation to do that thing to think of doing it. One had the capacity, the situation didn't mask its exercise, but one failed to manifest it. When Anne omits to get the milk, they're actions that she's performing. She's driving, looking here and there, thinking about this and that. But I'll take it that in at least many cases of unwitting omission, no action that one is performing is one's not doing the thing that one omits. For one thing, commonly any action that one is performing has causes that aren't causes of one's omission. In these cases, the omission isn't itself an action. Indeed, I think in many cases, one's omission isn't anything at all, or better, there's nothing that is the omission. How then might a control condition be satisfied in such a case, particularly if the control condition is construed in terms of freedom? One can have control over whether something is so in virtue of being able to exercise control in bringing about or preventing that thing. And since being able to aid doesn't entail A-ing, an agent might have control over whether something is so, even if she doesn't in fact exercise her control with respect to that thing. Even if in a case of unwitting omission, the agent doesn't exercise control with respect to whether she performs the omitted action, she might have control over whether she performs that action, for she might be able to exercise and have the opportunity to exercise such control. She might be able and have the opportunity to perform the action in question. She might be free to perform it, even if there's nothing that is her omission and is an exercise of freedom. In driving home via her usual route, we may suppose, Anne has the ability and opportunity to do otherwise. We may suppose, for example, that she can in Austen's all-in sense, take a different route. Likewise, we may suppose, with regard to omitting to get the milk, she can stop and get it. If so, then Anne has control over whether she omits to get the milk, even though there's no exercise of control by her that is her omission. Well, one might object to the supposition that the supposition I've just advanced cannot be correct in a case of unwitting omission. It doesn't occur to Anne to stop for milk. How can she make the stop without thinking of doing so? Of course, she might turn into the parking lot unintentionally, or end up with milk when she means to get juice, but that would hardly give us what is sought here. Still, I think the objection is unpersuasive. Let's note a distinction of scope. It might be that Anne is not able to bring it about that she intentionally gets the milk while not thinking of doing so. Even so, it might be that though she's not thinking of stopping for milk, she's able to bring it about that she intentionally gets milk. The plausibility that she lacks the first of these abilities should not be taken for plausibility that she lacks the second. To put the point differently, even if thinking of doing something is a necessary condition for exercising an ability to intentionally do that thing, this fact doesn't entail that thinking of doing that thing is a necessary condition for possessing the ability. Well, one might think that even if actually thinking of stopping for milk is not required for having the ability to make the stop, one has that ability, or the ability to intentionally make the stop, only if one can think to do this. But now, as I suggested earlier, there might well be at least two respects in which, on the occasion in question, Anne can think to make the stop. We may suppose that Anne's typical in the following respect. Generally, when she's promised to do something of this sort, she remembers to do it without having to make any effort at all to remember. We may suppose, that is, that she has a capacity of a kind characterized in the preceding section, a capacity to think at appropriate times without making any effort to recall, to do the things that she's only recently promised to do. Commonly on such occasions, she manifests this capacity. On the occasion in question, she didn't. But in the absence of madness or hypnotism or some such condition, there's no evident reason to think that she didn't possess it. Second, we may suppose that Anne has, in addition to this capacity, an ability to act in such a way that she brings it about that she thinks to do things that she needs to do. She can, for example, ask herself whether there's anything she needs to do that she's not thinking to do, and she can thereby bring it about that she remembers to do such things. When she exercises this ability, the exercise is the performance of a mental action, one aimed at discovery. The ability is a common human possession. Again, in the case at hand, Anne doesn't exercise this ability, but this fact doesn't suffice to show that she lacks it. One might wonder whether there might be lacking some necessary condition for Anne's exercising the ability to ask herself such a question. Well, it's not clear what such a missing necessary condition might be, but at any rate, again, a necessary condition for the exercise of an ability should not be confused with a necessary condition for its possession. We don't ordinarily take a failure to remember to do something, or a failure even to think of doing it, as disabling, as depriving one of the ability to do that thing. An agent who knows how to ride a bike, who is awake and in good health, with 2 good arms and 2 good legs, who has a bike available, and who would not have the bike taken away should she attempt to get on it, has several ordinary kinds of ability, as well as the opportunity to ride a bike on the occasion in question. If there's a kind of ability to act that requires indeterminism, She might have this kind as well, for it might be undetermined whether she'll ride the bike on this occasion. If because she isn't thinking of doing so, there's some further kind of ability to ride a bike that she then lacks, that's a rather extraordinary kind of ability. And now, a substantial argument would be needed to show that direct responsibility for a failure to do a certain thing requires an extraordinary ability of this kind to do it. Absent such an argument, we may reasonably take it that an agent can satisfy the control requirement for direct responsibility in a case of unwitting omission, for it appears that she can have any required kind of ability to do the thing that she omits to do. Well, I've argued that an agent can satisfy conditions that suffice for direct blameworthiness in a case of unwitting omission. But I've also said that the agent's failure to think to perform the omitted action in such a case is faulty. And the fault is, I think, a moral fault, something that can be ascribed to the agent and for which she's subject to moral criticism. She could be so criticized even if, because somebody reminded her or pointed out to her the need to perform the action in question, she ended up doing what she in fact omits to do. Given her obligation to perform the action in question, she should have remembered or thought on her own to do it. But if this is so, is the agent not blameworthy for her ignorance of the wrongness of her conduct? And is her blameworthiness for the wrongful omission now not indirect, tracing back to her blameworthiness for that ignorance? Well, consider the following claim. Call this principle DR. One can be directly responsible only for an action or an omission to act. If this claim is correct, then any moral failing that isn't an action or an omission to act isn't something for which one can be directly blameworthy. And if one isn't blameworthy for the failing in a way that traces back to one's blameworthiness for some prior action or omission, then it's a blameless moral fault. Given DR, we can have moral faults for which we aren't at all blameworthy. Although we can be appropriately criticized for them, we aren't worthy of blame for them. If DR is correct, then a moral failing for which one isn't blameworthy can figure in the etiology of an action for which one is blameworthy. One might be blameworthy for acting on a malicious desire, even if one isn't blameworthy for having that bad desire. Similarly, a morally faulty failure to think to do a certain thing might figure in the etiology of an unwitting omission for which one is blameworthy, even if one isn't blameworthy for the failure to think to do the thing in question. Further, if an agent's failure to remember or think to do a certain thing arises from some morally objectionable attitudes of hers, perhaps she doesn't take her commitment seriously, or she's excessively self-centered or inconsiderate, she might still be directly blameworthy for an unwitting omission to do that thing, for she might not be blameworthy for having the morally bad attitudes that give rise to her failure to think to do the thing. Having those attitudes isn't an action or an omission to act, and it might not stem from any actions or omissions of hers in a way that makes her indirectly blameworthy for having those attitudes. Note further that in claiming that in a case of unwitting omission, it might be that the agent should have thought to perform the omitted action, I don't say that the agent had an obligation to think of so acting. Along with DR, consider the following. This is principle OA. Our moral obligations are obligations to act or not act in certain ways. If this claim is correct, then although in a case of unwitting omission, the failure to think to perform the action in question is morally faulty, this fault isn't itself a breach of obligation. Failure to perform the action in question might be a breach of obligation, as it would be in Anne's case, for she'd said that she'd stopped for milk. It's of course controversial whether DR and OA are correct, but they're widely accepted, and there's much to be said for them. One thing to be said in favor of the ability view is that it doesn't conflict with these claims. Conversely, an account of blameworthiness for unwitting omission that seeks to ground blameworthiness for the omission in direct blameworthiness for the failure to think to do the thing in question, or in direct blameworthiness for attitudes that give rise to that failure, faces the task of countering arguments for DR and OA. So the proposed account of the cognitive condition for responsibility borrows a great deal from George Scher's perceptive treatment of responsibility without awareness. As on Scher's account, so on the ability view, what one can reasonably be expected to have in mind depends on one's obligations, and it's sensitive to one's cognitive capacities and one's circumstances. But there are differences between the ability view and Scher's account that are worth noting. Although Scher's focus is on what he calls an epistemic condition, what I've called the cognitive condition, he observes that responsibility requires satisfaction of a voluntariness condition as well. And about the latter, he states, to say that agents can be responsible for acts that they have not in any sense performed voluntarily would indeed be to distort our concept of responsibility beyond recognition. So the task, he takes it, is to work out a version of the requirement that can be satisfied when an agent isn't aware of some morally relevant feature of what she's doing. As I've maintained, unwitting omissions, at least typically, aren't actions of any kind. Further, they aren't voluntary in any ordinary sense. They don't proceed from the will or from one's own choice or consent, and they aren't done by design or intention. If a control condition might be satisfied in such a case, it can't require voluntariness. The ability view offers a way to do this. An agent satisfies the control condition, the account says, if she has an ability and the opportunity to perform the action that's omitted. Further, there is, I think, good reason to hold that an ability of a familiar kind, as well as an opportunity to do the thing in question, is required if one's to be directly blameworthy for an unwitting omission. However objectionable Anne's attitudes might be, and however they might figure in her failure to recall her errand, she isn't blameworthy for not getting milk if every store in town was out of it, assuming that she isn't responsible for that fact. She might be criticizable for her failure to recall and for having attitudes that led to it, and she might be blameworthy for failing to try to get the milk, but the failure to bring it home isn't on her. Likewise, if her car had broken down or she'd suffered a sudden paralysis and she couldn't get to the store. The ability view then appeals to an agent's having an ability and opportunity to do the thing that she omitted to do. If these are indeed required for direct blameworthiness, such a requirement might be added to George's epistemic requirement, yielding an overall account that closely resembles the ability view. The second difference is a requirement imposed by George, but not by the ability view. When an agent lacks awareness that her act is wrong, George's view requires that the agent's failure to recognize the wrongness be caused by, as he puts it at one point, the interaction of some combination of his constitutive attitudes, dispositions, and traits. One might balk at the idea that a failure to recognize something can be caused, but explanation is surely possible. An agent's attitudes, dispositions, and traits might well explain why she fails on some occasion to recognize the wrongness of her conduct. Suppose that an agent wrongly omits to do a certain thing. Suppose that, although she didn't think to do it, she was capable of thinking to do it. Her capacity wasn't masked by any excusing situational factor. And she was able to do and had the opportunity to do the thing in question. Could there nevertheless fail to be an explanatory connection between the agent's attitudes, disposition, and traits, and her failure to see that she was wrongly failing to do the thing in question? And if so, would the lack of such an explanatory connection preclude her being directly blameworthy for her omission? I'm not able to see that there's an affirmative answer to both of these questions. But if there is, then the ability view can be supplemented with a requirement of the explanatory connection in question. And if it is, and if George's view is supplemented with an ability requirement, then I see no significant difference between them. An agent who unwittingly omits to A, failing then to think to A, might have bad attitudes that explain her failure of thought. But must there be any bad attitudes that figure in this way if we're to have direct blameworthiness for an unwitting omission? Imagine that Anne judges her husband's requests and judges filling her commitments to be as important as one should. While driving home, she was attending to traffic and listening to a news report on the radio. Suppose that no misjudgment of the value of anything and no imbalance in the strengths of her several motives led to her forgetting her errand. Her configuration of evaluative judgments is not at fault. Her memory is. Many of us are wont to say, following P.F. Strawson, that the reactive attitudes that often partly constitute blame are responses to an agent's quality of will. In this latest version of Anne's case, as far as her evaluative attitudes and her motivations are concerned, her will might be good enough. Her evaluations might be directed where they should, with the valences they should have, and her motivations appropriately balanced. In fact, as Strawson sometimes put it, the expectation reflected in a reactive attitude such as indignation is a demand for the manifestation of a reasonable degree of goodwill or regard on the part of others toward all those on whose behalf moral indignation may be felt. Although Anne might have a will of satisfactory quality, she doesn't manifest it in doing what she should do on the occasion in question. The failure is a failure to do what a Strawsonian might think we expect each other to do, a failure in response to which it can be appropriate to blame. I see no clear basis in what Strawson says that lets the agent off the hook when there's nothing objectionable about the attitudes of hers that explain her failure to manifest goodwill. Still, we might think that it isn't blame that's fitting in such a case. Perhaps Anne should assume responsibility for going back out to get milk, but it might be said she shouldn't feel guilty and her husband has no basis for even minor resentment. There's so little at stake in this case that it hardly seems to matter. It might help with the question at hand to consider cases with more serious consequences. There are an average of about 20 cases of the following kind in the United States each year. A parent or other caregiver forgets that she has an infant in the car with her. She leaves the child unattended in the car, often for the length of the workday, and the child dies of heat stroke. It might be thought that the parents or other caregivers, I'll henceforth just refer to the parents, it might be thought that those who do this must be terrible people, but very often they aren't. Commonly, they're loving and, except for this incident, attentive in caring for their children. Parents whose omissions result in these deaths are typically overcome with grief and guilt. They're often suicidal for a prolonged period. They suffer not only the death of their children, but a horrible sense of their own complicity. They almost always blame themselves for their child's death. They also often commit a great deal of time and energy to the prevention of further deaths in this manner, speaking to parents' groups and advocating new safety measures. Consider only cases in which the forgetting parent had what I've called a goodwill. She valued and loved the child as much as a parent should. She didn't value other things or care for them more than one should. Her motivations were acceptably balanced. There's much to be said for the idea that when it comes to such individuals, we do better to offer sympathy rather than blame. And it might be that perfect justice would administer no punishment to them. Still, these thoughts don't rule out the idea that these thoughts don't rule out the agent's blameworthiness. One might be blameworthy for something even if no one, not even oneself, should blame or punish one in any way. Worthiness of blame is but part of its overall warrant. With respect to these parents' attitudes toward themselves, we might consider that rather than a feeling of guilt, it should be what Bernard Williams called agent regret. The constituent thought of this attitude, Williams said, is that it would have been better, in some respect at least, that one had not done what one did. Unlike mere regret, which, as Williams sees it, one can have with respect to another's agency, agent regret acknowledges, from the inside as it were, the role that one has oneself played in bringing about some outcome. It's generally thought that Williams meant to distinguish agent regret from guilt, with the latter, but not the former, involving an attribution to oneself of responsibility. The expression of agent regret, Williams observed, is often a willingness to undertake compensation, restitution, or reparation. Such actions can have symbolic value even when they can't compensate for losses. Adapting a point made by Williams, we might think that although the good-willed parents aren't blameworthy, they nevertheless acquire reasons of a special sort to engage in some such activities, as in fact many of them do. Discussing Williams's example of the lorry driver, who through no fault of his own runs over and kills a child, Tim Scanlon observes that despite the agent's not being to blame, the objective stigma attaching to him alters the meaning of his interactions with others, such as the parents of the victim. The stigma can warrant the driver's telling the parents how sorry he is, though what's warranted, Scanlon says, is not an apology, but an expression of regret. There's a case to be made, then, that the fitting attitude of the good-willed parents in question toward themselves is agent regret and not guilt, and that the special reasons they acquire to make amends or prevent further such tragedies arise from objective stigma and not from blameworthiness. Extending the point to all cases of good-willed agents who unwittingly omit to do certain things, it might be said that we never have direct blameworthiness in such cases. Blameworthiness, it might be said, requires bad attitudes. But there are striking differences between Williams's lorry driver and the parents on whom we're focusing here. The driver, Williams's driver, did nothing wrong. The parents certainly did. The driver could not reasonably have been expected to see the need to act differently. It's reasonable to expect the parents to have been aware of the need to remove the children. They had the capacity to do so. The driver could not have avoided killing the child. The parents were able to prevent their children's deaths. It's noteworthy that a change of routine, that stress or a lack of sleep, are often factors in the cases under discussion here. And these factors can mask or diminish capacities to remember to do things. But in common cases of this sort, such factors aren't so severe that a normative expectation seems out of place, an expectation that the parent remember the child. And such factors are so common that, were we to take them as excusing, we would, it seems, excuse far too much. In the cases in question, these factors might mitigate blameworthiness without eliminating it. When it comes to the agents on whom we're focusing here, if, as is often the case, they have ordinary capacities of memory and thought, if they had the requisite ability to do what they omitted to do, and if circumstances weren't so extreme as to excuse their failures, then it isn't entirely clear what excuses them from blame. Again, what's objectionable in their quality of will is not their values or motivation, but their failure to manifest their goodwill in doing something that they were obligated to do. Well, luck plays a role in these cases, and this fact might move us to think that it isn't blameworthiness that's at issue. Although the parents could have remembered to remove the children, they didn't remember, and given our focus on cases in which the parents were good-willed, it doesn't seem wrong to say that they were horribly unlucky. Perhaps an unfortunate confluence of distraction, lack of sleep, and altered routine caused an uncharacteristic lapse. It's with respect to cases such as these that we might have the sickening feeling that it could have happened to us. One principle ruling out moral luck is non-comparative. An agent is not responsible for what is due to factors beyond her control, it says. One might appeal to a principle of this sort to justify the denial of blameworthiness in the cases we're now considering. Another principle is comparative. Agents cannot differ with respect to their blameworthiness if the differences in their agency are due to differences in luck. Comparing the good-willed agent who forgot to remove her child from the car with one who remembered, one might appeal to this comparative principle to deny the blameworthiness of the first of these, for the second one is not blameworthy. But both principles, as stated here, appear too strong. The parent who remembers would seem to be morally responsible for carrying out her duty, even if not meriting great praise. And it would seem just as much a matter of luck, something of great significance to her that's beyond her control, that she remembers, as it is for the forgetting parent that she forgets. There does seem to be a difference between these two with respect to moral responsibility. The parent who remembers merits at least recognition that she carried out her duty. The one who forgets does not. And note that the difference here is not just a matter of the scope of their responsibility. It's not just a matter of what they're responsible for, but it's a matter of whether they deserve any credit at all. Note as well that the principles identified here would similarly deny direct blameworthiness in cases of unwitting omissions by bad-willed agents. Consider a parent who values the infant or cares about it less than she should, or values or cares about something else more than she should, and whose evaluative attitudes interact in a way that explains her failure to remember to remove the child. It may well be that almost all parents with similarly bad attitudes almost all of the time remember to remove their parents from their infants from their cars. The very few who don't are, in an important respect, unlucky. The difference between these few and their bad-willed fellows with respect to what they do is due to luck. If we consider only the question of direct blameworthiness for the omission, the comparative principle would have us deny any difference in blameworthiness between parents of these two groups. But if we accept moral luck here, it's unclear why we shouldn't accept it as well in the cases of good-willed agents who unwittingly omit to do things they ought to do. Well, such cases raise the problem of moral luck in a particularly sharp fashion. We might hope to limit the damage by denying blameworthiness in these cases. Alternatively, recognizing that the threat is present across the board, we might affirm blameworthiness even here while adjusting our view of its profundity. The ability view could be supplemented with a provision that an agent is directly blameworthy for an unwitting omission only if the agent's forgetting to do or not thinking to do the thing in question is explained by bad will. But since that provision doesn't evade the problem of moral luck anyway, considerations of luck seem not to warrant its addition. If anyone can be directly blameworthy for an unwitting omission, it appears that a good-willed agent can be.